Our mission is to share innovations which cover the face of education to help kind of transform and change the general perception around what innovation is in education, to help people have access to this information and create a positive vibe around it. So when we're selecting the innovations at HundrED, we are focusing on innovations that cover the entire breadth of education, which can be useful to all different stakeholders. So we have to kind of understand what we thought this year, what do the stakeholders really want in education? What does the education landscape look like right now? So that was kind of how this report came to be, because we wanted to conduct a piece of formal research around it. So the research team's focus for the year is to kind of seek and understand the innovations. So we go through a process where it's documenting them, setting up interviews, understanding them for innovativeness, impact and scalability, as well as different factors. And we wanted to have a guide that led us to cover the entire themes, as well as the different regions around the world. So this report resulted in the themes that have enabled us to kind of categorize the innovations. So we used a mixed methods approach based on both resource, and we felt like it was an appropriate methodology for this type of work, conducting a literature review, looking at different types of pieces, exploring what different stakeholders thought needed to improve in education. We didn't limit ourselves to just academic papers, because the nature of education and different people's both opinions and evidence doesn't necessarily lie on things like Google Scholar and typical literature reviews, because many educators don't use this as their typical platform. So we did tap into as well things like blogs, general media articles, social media, to kind of get a more in-depth understanding. And alongside this, we also used a survey to focus particularly on what young people said, because we found when we were doing this State of the Debate review that it wasn't really capturing the voices of young people. So that was why we kind of chose this approach. And I'd like to kind of pass over to Freddie to kind of do an overview of what the Stakeholder Section findings kind of brought to light. And then she can also talk briefly about the importance of children's rights, which sets us up to, and for me to kind of summarize the youth survey findings and the mapping at the end of the report and how people might use that.
Great. And can I just say at the very start, what a wonderful job you guys did.
Thanks.
Yes, it's really amazing, fantastic, well done report. I'm actually launching I've been running a similar research on my own, actually, with another colleague of mine.
Yeah.
Done amazing work here. So, and I just realized by looking at the report that Jessica and you, Federica, you're the two that was putting this together, actually. So.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you so much. That's really nice, because we've received like lots of bits of feedback from the survey form, but it's really nice to have that interaction. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Freddie, over to you.
Yep, so I'm Federica, I'm the research assistant, and I worked with Jess on the report as well as some other collaborators. And I focused a lot on the state of the debate, looking at what lots of different stakeholders in education were prioritizing as, I guess, needs for improving education. So we looked at systems level, school leaders and educators, thought leaders, academics, NGOs, employers, parents, carers, youth, and the general population, just to go over them again. And we interestingly found that a lot of the stakeholders did have similar areas that they thought there were needs. However, the prioritization that they gave were quite different. So for example, parents and carers really prioritize themselves and their role in education, discussing it 44.67% throughout their sources. So it clearly shows, I would say, how they're feeling neglected from the conversations and how they would like to be involved and see their role developing. And that's something that we're looking at now through innovations that are trying to approach and utilize parents in education. We also, like Jess said, saw a big gap between people discussing youth and their role in education, which is, like Jess said, why we chose to do a global youth survey. And I currently am completing my master's in children's rights and child protection. So I've done a lot of focus work on the role of student voice and participation, and how that is a right of a child to be involved in their education, as well as obviously having access to education. And we're really looking at that at HundrED at the moment, and how we can give students more autonomy over their education, looking at innovations that provide that and that are child-centric and are meeting all the needs of a child.
Great.
Yeah, I think that was what was really important to us, was to make sure that the child's voice was particularly heard in this arena, because it's so often not the case. And it was nice that the writer at Forbes kind of focused on that in the article that they wrote about the report. So,
And,
sorry, yeah, off you go.
I think it's really interesting that you cited some of the previous studies that were done in Ireland and also by the World Bank. So apparently there has been, I guess, some efforts made in the past to understand the young people's point of view, but I agree with you. They seem to be, for the most part, largely ignored.
Yeah, and quite trapping surveys, so not as open-ended or enabling them to consider education past the sphere in which it's being initially presented. So the surveys were kind of focusing on like just a few different elements, which brings us nicely onto this point where with the youth survey that we presented, we had kind of come up with quite wide-ranging but multiple themes from the initial State of the Debate review, looking at the different areas that needed to improve in education. So when we were presenting these choices, there was 18 options, as well as an opportunity to say other things of their own accord, which they rarely said, because I think it was covered by the different 18 things. And the fact that on average, nearly all the respondents were selecting at least kind of like half of them, you know, it shows that so many of those different areas and elements of education are necessary to improve. And the findings of the survey as well, with the particular one of them focusing on that they want to learn skills to help them in their future careers, showing that they don't find the education that they're currently receiving authentic or relevant to the real world. They continually commented on that as well, because there's obviously an opportunity to provide open-ended response in, you know, following the opportunity to select these different options. And I think it was also interesting at how important the physical learning environment was to them. And I think this is actually quite representative of the type of world, especially that generation is living in a world like where they do recognize the effect of aesthetic on your well-being, more so than perhaps other people have prioritized, especially when they live in social media. They are aware of the way that people look at them and the surroundings and how it affects their emotional and physical well-being. So I think they're looking at their school environment after having like access to multiple images around the world of what different places can look like, and realizing that it's not the best potentially for their learning.
I relate what you say, Jessica, to how the vast majority of adults in the working world work in offices that are drab and uninspiring and windowless, with no access to nature, really.
Yeah.
And it also makes me think of how, on the contrary, in schools like Steiner schools and Montessori schools, where aesthetics are emphasized, environment, architecture, and access to nature. So it's wonderful that you included this point in the survey.
Yeah, and we found that because the year prior to this, I was kind of doing the very initial review for HundrED, finding the innovations from around the world. And so I really learned a lot about the different types of learning environments that are extremely progressive. And one of the innovations that was selected, because it was so easy to implement and has scaled and is innovative, was Kayla Dells's flexible seating model, because it enables educators around the world to make changes based on their budget to create an environment that enables each child to thrive. So they have an opportunity to sit in the spaces that they want to sit in and create the rules for the classroom together. So it's a very democratic way of being, but also recognizing the importance of the environment. And I think that's the point, I guess the point of the research is that the innovations should reflect the desires and needs of the different stakeholders, especially young people.
And just a quick question, Jessica. What is the name of this person that you mentioned? Kayla
Delza. I can send you an email afterwards if that's okay.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see what she discovered and what she surveyed in terms of the different learning spaces.
Yeah, no problem.
That's an important element in my development of a different approach to education. Is that's one of the emphasis, really. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I have lots of different pieces of information I can share about that and different innovations in this space and a few different organizations. So more than happy to help. And then I think what was interesting in the comments of the findings was that they were particularly highlighting the importance of the meaningful relationships with the people that they work with and the types of relationships that they were seeking, which also was highlighted in the State of the Debate review, was not your traditional educator relationship, but more of a facilitation, which I think reflects the more progressive transformative models that we have found in education, which have been popping up, I mean, for many years, but particularly there's a drive at the moment when you look at things like Big Picture Learning School and the way that their model is growing, when you look at Templestowe College in Australia and the way that they're scaling, as well as many other models around the world. So I think, and they were also very keen to develop this global outlook, and they were looking to both develop their life skills, such as the communication skills, because they recognize the importance of that in this world, as well as like having to live a sustainable lifestyle. So over 50% of them wanted to know how to do that within their education. Like they recognize that's extremely important. Yet when we previously did a webinar on sustainability, following our pursuit of a sustainability spotlight, educators were often feeling that that it wasn't prioritized anymore, that it was kind of a wave of importance a few years ago, but now they were being asked to focus on maybe gender and the Me Too movement, and sustainability was moving kind of out of the field of view, which is a shame.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, Jessica, that HundrED decided to include that as an element for the survey. And it also reminds me of the grad school in Indonesia, right? Which I think but I think more importantly, I think when people talk about fads and trends in education, that I think it's really important to have that underlying principles or themes that somehow the education must address. That whatever innovation that it comes up with never strays too far from those underlying important elements that we're trying to foster within the human being.
And I think what we realized when we were mapping this, which kind of brings us to the final section, is that when we mapped out the different themes that came out of the survey and the State of the Debate review, is that these fundamentals are extremely important, and you have to kind of, the ideal way to look at education is in a very holistic multi-stakeholder perspective. So about building the leaders in education, building those very strong partnerships out into the community, both locally and globally, to both learn from each other, but also to recognize the importance of collaborating and not reinventing the wheel continually. So when we're seeking these innovations, one of the reasons they often scale and are impactful is based on their ability to collaborate. So that was one of the things that we kind of found as a major finding within this mapping. And we hope that different leaders in education around the world could use the map and reflect on the way that either their school or their district or their organization is enabling different aspects of it extremely well and celebrating that, but then recognizing the ways that they could improve other aspects and looking at it from a different, more holistic perspective. Because if we focus on trends and fads, you're not going to enable education to flourish and move forward in a way that is sustainable.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think one of the biggest challenges in education is to somehow remain highly interdisciplinary and holistic by combining and synthesizing the different aspects of what is permanent and into the young person's life and their future. So that means engaging with, I think, all different aspects of society, all types of subject matters.
Absolutely.
And that's the challenge, right? So
yeah. Freddie, would you like to add anything else regarding like that part of it or mapping to summarize?
I think the mapping part for us was really interesting as well, just to see the wide breadth. We had a lot, I guess, to start with, and narrowing it down and working out through our research what really were the biggest issues and the biggest areas that needed facing. And I think the youth input really helped us develop that and led us to our final map, which is in the end of the report. And it really shows a wide breadth of different themes, and we've been working really hard to find innovations this year that are addressing these needs that have come out of our research.
Yeah. Okay, so we'd be excited to kind of open the floor now and hear questions from you or feedback that we can kind of support with, respond to, whatever you would like.
Hey guys, it's Zineb. So first of all, I would say that as well, I'm very impressed with the report and enjoyed reading it quite a bit. I thought that it was definitely really refreshing to get to actually see and hear views of young people, which, as you say, there's a lot of talk about youth-focused, student-centered, etc., and it's not necessarily reflected in the way we currently design our schools or take into consideration their point of view.
Yeah.
So I guess my first question is not necessarily about the report, but more about the way it made you think about ways that we could more systematically include youth voices in the conversation. And given how much research you've done about that, I'm just wondering if you've also seen innovations that do that in a very good way and can be used as a way to develop a best practice to include youth voices in the process. Good question.
So I think I've seen it done in at multiple levels. So right down from a teacher in a classroom continually reflecting upon their practice by engaging students after every single class. So providing a very quick, short feedback on how it made them feel. Did they feel it's like that kind of learning objective, but rather than it being a passive experience, really engaging with the students in a way that I guess really excites them. And then you've got democratic models all the way down to kindergarten, where you're kind of designing a classroom and the experience of learning in a way that is entirely student-led. So I think it's that the feedback is a natural part of the model. So we have democratic kindergartens on the HundrED site, which is spread across to multiple different regions in Germany. But I know that Yakov Hecht with the democratic education model is also widely.
And the Sudbury Valley model that has been really taking especially I guess in Europe, there's I think more than 60 schools as well as associations both in the US and in Europe following that model. But there's still especially the Sudbury Valley, for instance, is almost considered the really extreme extent of how, I'd say, with air quotes, liberal you can be with education.
Yeah. I find those models I think they're really amazing opportunities for certain types of individuals. And I think the future of education moves into a space that enables each child to have the right level of support and challenge necessary to grow in terms of their learning. I think I come back to big picture again, because big picture are kind of a balance between moving forwards in a way that enables the student to decide what internships they want to do, commit to 2 to 3 days a week out into the community, whilst also kind of following a more, it's not fully traditional, but still having a similarish curriculum to what already exists, but with a model where there is a facilitator who is looking after 13 to 14 young people who kind of grow together. And so I think it's the reorganization of education that will really allow students to provide feedback continually on their learning and make it truly personalized. And I've seen so many amazing examples of different schools doing so, but that a community should provide perhaps different levels of autonomy dependent upon the child and what they feel works for them at the time. And in that sense, that's how the student has feedback on their own learning and enables them to improve. And then in a more organizational way, like they did in Ireland, kind of encouraging governments and different system leaders to reach out to do these meaningful surveys and design them with students and educators and parents to really draw out the necessary changes that young people feel needs to happen in their education, so that systems leaders are becoming more and more involved. And it's ingrained in the children's rights, which I'm going to pass over to Freddie, because I feel like you have the most knowledge on that. So if you want to add anything to that, Freddie.
Yeah, I think for us it's about moving away from tokenistic attempts to engage children, which is very common. Most schools will have a children's committee who want to make changes, and they're allowed to have their input, but whether or not they're actually taken into account is a different matter. And I think children are very aware that they're not actually being listened to, even though they're given that space. And it's about providing a space and culture and mindset where there is a reciprocal relationship, where they're working together with their teachers, open discussions. And if something isn't feasible, because we've all worked with children, they sometimes come up with rather extravagant ideas, but it's just acknowledging that and discussing why it might not be feasible, and then maybe looking at a way that they can still address it, but looking at a different way of doing that.
Yeah.
And if we're looking at children's rights and the Uncrc, which is the document signed by every nation but the US currently, as we've said in the report, Article 12 is about respecting the views of children and giving them that space and collaborating with them. And I think education is a great forum for us to start changing that culture and making sure that we all take into account their feelings and what they really need from education, and not just taking their word as gospel, but just working together to move forward in the best way possible.
To make it like truly personalized and passionate. And I think Freddie picked up on something really important there about mindset. So if you take the example of student government lotteries in Bolivia, where they were trying to reinvent the wheel regarding student democracy. So if you think back to a traditional model, is a student president is usually voted by the student body. And they changed that model by saying, this is a voluntary buy-in. They got more than half the school actually wanted to be part of that student council. So then they pulled it out, like, so it didn't cost anything, or you can do it digitalized online, but basically pull out and see if you're that color bean. And if you get the red bean, then you're going to be on the student council for the next 3 months, and you're going to learn the different aspects and work together. And when the educators bought in to the idea, it was their mindset that was vital, not the students. They already knew how to take autonomy and make good decisions and work through things together through a facilitator model. But in some of the schools, the teachers weren't willing to actually follow through. Like Freddie said, you have to really respect what they've decided. And there was an example where the students actually decided between them to suspend one of the other students because they'd done something quite terrible to another student. And they were like, yeah, we feel that he should be, suspended for the next 3 days. And they actually went against that, did a more, an entirely different thing. And multiple times they kept disrespecting the decision of the student body. And then you just lose respect, and they don't feel like they matter. And then the relationships break down as a consequence.
Yeah, if I may just follow up on that, I'm also wondering if in your research you've actually seen a discrepancy between types of students based on the school and innovativeness of the school they attend. Because obviously there are schools that are going down that path. So I'm just wondering if you see a shift or a divide between what I'd call traditional models and more progressive, innovative models in terms of youth satisfaction with their education.
Yeah, I think that was one of the downfalls of the design of the survey, was that we didn't ask them about what type of education they currently received, partly because we wanted to do a short capture of what they felt they wanted to improve in education, and then partly because their reflection of it might not necessarily be the reality, because they might not know where their school lies in relation to innovativeness.
Okay.
But it would be good to explore, definitely.
Yeah, I'm just wondering.
Yeah,
especially since there is such a strong movement now for more and more progressive models to take hold and more student-centered.
Yeah.
Including the youth voice into the advocacy for more of that model could actually be quite interesting eventually.
Definitely. I think that would be a really interesting piece.
I think it's quite interesting as well if you look at primary school websites who have been involved with something like the Rights, Respect and School Award, which is run by UNICEF, for example. And it's interesting to see that on the schools that are participating in a project like that their voices are actually quoted throughout the website, and they play an integral part, and they often have their own section of the school website. And if you look at other school websites, there's less about that, and it's very parent focused with not a lot about the children. So I think maybe looking at websites, sometimes it is a bit of a capture of how they focus on their students within their school and their opinions.
Yeah, you could even do an analysis of the portrayal of children based on school sites and then see if it correlated with the type of pedagogy and student sentiment. That would be interesting.
It would be.
Definitely. Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Philip.
Thanks.
But I mean, based on the fact that you've collected these data from different young people and from around the world, I mean, did you have a sense of the types of schools they come from? Like, do you have a sense for that without citing hard data?
We knew some of them just based on the fact that some of our partnerships were with the innovations were clear between the participant data. So for example, we have a very active ambassador in Macedonia, and then we got 10 respondents from Macedonia. So I think we were pretty sure they were from that kind of a certain type of progressive learning environment. But what was interesting actually in relation to what you're talking about in terms of like country and specific differences was in the responses, what we noticed was if the respondent was from the UK or the US, they didn't talk about in the comments their education in relation to their country. And I think that's because they have been seen and are recognized on a global stage, comparably to students from France and other different countries who kind of, and Taiwan, who commented and said, in Taiwan, in France, education is like this. So I felt like there was very much an important point there to be seen reading between the lines that these children don't believe that they're being taken like seriously on, you know, their country's being taken seriously in this global stage and global arena because they wouldn't comment on a very specific country because it wasn't asked for, it wasn't part of the questions. And so I think that shows like something about the global stage at the moment.
Well, yeah, well, I'm from Taiwan actually. So I take notice of the fact that 70% of the responses came from Taiwan and the US, where I also spent a considerable amount of time. But I'm curious, right? Because I mean, you do span across, I think, many different ethnicities, in addition to the number of countries you've covered.
Yeah.
And I would be inclined to extrapolate the results and apply it to all the industrialized societies around the world, even though, you know, you didn't cover all of the other countries. But what is your feeling about that? Would you feel confident and positive about kind of taking the snapshot as a pretty good indicator of the types of improvements that children are wanting from their education in industrialized societies?
I think it's a good start. Like, I think that it would be ignoring the limitations of the methodology to say that I'm very confident that it's a snapshot, because it was just under 30% of the rest of the data was from, I think, 17 different or 16 different countries. So that's, for me, it's a good step in the direction, because when you look at the other types of data capturing voices from students, it's not usually as varied as that, but it's also too little a piece of data to really take deeply seriously the other aspects. I felt like it was quite confident to be able to say, you know, what was kind of going on in certain aspects of the US, but I would have wanted, like Zineb mentioned, to really control more for location and type of school and different type of education, which would have, I think, required the input of an educator. So it's a trade-off between wanting to empower the young person to have their own voice and have their voice independently, and then involving a heavy resource piece, but I do think it is a good indicator, good enough that we felt that we wanted to share with the education community some of the different areas in which they were frustrated, especially having had those rich comments, because there's extremely high response rate to have an open-end comments, over 70% on the first one. So in short, yes and no. What do you think, Freddie?
I think, just reiterating what you're saying, I think it's, like you say, it does provide information, and we did see patterns in what was being said, so we can't ignore that, but also on a global scale, it is just a tiny snapshot in a big thing. But we're hoping that to continue with this on a yearly basis, there'll be more people knowing about the report and the survey. It's always hard on the first one to get involvement, and obviously at the time we did it, countries like Australia, for example, were on school holidays, which also causes missing out on a broad groups, and maybe extending the time period as well, and just learning from the first one and how we can engage more questions and develop it further and try and get a more global spread. But I think there's a lot of value in the information that we found.
And I'd love to I think this type of research requires partnership, because to analyze this amount of data is not small, and I was doing the majority of the data analysis as well as the comments, so it's quite time consuming when you're looking at both quantitative and qualitative together. So also resource based is the limitation there too.
Great, thank you.
No problem. Any more questions? I can see Alejandro has joined us.
Who's on mute?
I actually have a second question for you.
Yeah.
And basically it has to do with something that you mentioned earlier on in the report. And also that comes across as obviously something that's very important to consider, which is basically in measurement of success of schools or innovations that you've seen. And that can come either from the research of the report or your general work. So there was a quote about someone saying, in the Finnish way of doing things, when we want to make the school better, we don't what we consider first is how we can make the students' well-being better.
Yeah, I think that was passing.
I'm just wondering to what extent in your research so far have you seen that measurement actually being measured? Because we're having it's a side conversation, but we're definitely in my organization and in general looking more and more for how we can advocate for student well-being actually being a measurement of impact, and actually being something that education is supposed to provide. So I'm just wondering what you think about that, or if your research has given you a different perspective on this element.
Good question. I think it's super important, and like you said, this piece of research didn't focus on that, but for conducting research into the innovations, and when we're understanding the innovation for impact and scale, this is really focusing on the impact element, right? So does that innovation that's focusing on holistic well-being or well-being in general, are they measuring it, and is it improving? And I think what we've seen is a variety of different types of innovations, and I'm sure Freddie will jump in here as well with the types of innovations she's been researching this year that are measuring it to different extents. So I think Roots of Empathy is a good one, because they have 17 years of research to back up the way that their program is developing pro-social skills. It's enabling children to be more empathic and understanding towards each other from a really young age to I think 14 years. So that's an example that's kind of a very evidence-based program, which has been shown to improve things like caring and sharing and inclusion, as well as decreasing aggression. So that would be my go-to example off the top of my head that I think shows that it can be taken seriously, and they are measuring it, and they've been running for a long time and are in multiple countries, I think 11 now actually, and they also use the voice of the children to change the curriculum based on their feedback. So I think that's another element, bringing back into how can youth have a really meaningful impact on the way that they're educated. And they've done really smart partnerships with universities and also have their own research conference every year.
What's the name of the organization again?
Roots of Empathy.
Roots of Empathy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Frederica.
Oh, no worries. I was going to say, I think it's been really interesting in the interviews this year with innovators to see the frustration in data-driven impact, in that for them to scale, people are expecting data to show that they're having impact within numbers, and to measure student well-being isn't really a number thing. It would be comments. And I think as someone working with children, or the ones who work with students, they know when the well-being is getting better. And a lot of the innovators that I speak to, they say they have all these massive impacts. I never knew that just this thing around times tables would give them so much confidence. And I'd actually say that's the biggest achievement of my innovation. It's not them learning their times tables, it's the confidence in maths that they've had from that. However, they can't measurably show that in the same way that you can show that they've completed all their times tables within 6 months and they can do it by heart. And I think it's changing the way that we measure impact and how we do research, and acknowledging these student well-being and taking educators' comments and how well they know their students. And
it's a hard balance, because some educators do self-report. They get the students to measure their well-being, and all the educators provide commentary on it, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, like what Freddie's saying, and just kind of sharing it in good faith. But it really depends on their knowledge and insight into evidence. So it's hard to discriminate against an innovation that maybe isn't as progressed in terms of me and Freddie have talked about this a lot, like, how can you discriminate against a country that doesn't necessarily have the same level of the education that we've defined within the West, but their innovation is maybe doing exactly the same thing. So how you can explore different ways for them to communicate that, right? That's right, what we're talking about, I suppose, Freddie, here.
Yeah, it's also an interesting dynamic that there's more and more conversations happening and gaps being identified, that we want students to be happy at school. Yeah. And we want to be able to say, are you satisfied with your education? And are you happy when you go in the morning to school? Yeah. But we're not measuring that, or actually taking that into consideration in impact analysis that lead to funding of innovations.
Yeah, and I think it definitely should. I think it should be part of an important factor that an innovation, when we're researching the innovations, if it's not child-centric and it doesn't show some evidence of benefiting the child as a whole, then we wouldn't select it. Like, it wouldn't be put forward for potential selection, sorry. And you've just reminded me as well that there is the Positive Education Institute in Australia, which kind of came out of the movement of the science of positive psychology to enable kind of children and communities to flourish, and focusing on how you can measure psychology and well-being. And I hope that in the future, these types of institutes, which are opening up, and then other different types of organizations that are focusing on measuring different types of social skills, will help with this movement of getting recognition for it, because I think, like, ultimately it does require some evidence base.
Definitely.
Like Mutty Grease as well, like, which is a social emotional learning program using dogs actually at the center of it. And you don't even actually have to have a dog in the classroom to improve social emotional understanding of each other. And that was done through Yale. So when you have these partnerships, I guess they are able to measure them, but that requires money and an understanding of how to make those partnerships, and not everybody can be afforded access to it. So a lot of the time it's based on a theory of change that is based on something like that. And I think sometimes that is evidence that is good enough in certain aspects, dependent upon context.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I have to admit that there was a bit of a self-interested question, because I'm currently organizing a roundtable with only education funders around whether they have the right impact measurements in mind and whether they should expand their view.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it is surprisingly hard to find people who are just willing to ask questions to students that are like, are you satisfied with your education? Are you happy? It's cool.
Yeah.
Can you either rate that or answer yes or no? Like, that is just, it's not even that expensive or that complicated to put in place.
No, I think it's because they know the answer is no, and that's going to look bad for them. Isn't it?
So sad to hear.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, potentially, yeah, very true in most cases.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with all the stats coming out about mental health and increased suicide rates. And I think they know that that falls directly in line with the education that they're providing.
So,
any more questions? Yeah.
I guess, are you planning to do another survey like this, in the near future?
I think it's within HundrED. I think HundrED are looking to develop this scope and continue to put children at the forefront of providing feedback 100%. I couldn't say exactly what the next piece of research would be because that hasn't been decided yet, but I know that it's of deep interest and importance to help every child flourish, hence the name.
Yeah, exactly. Because data like this, and especially with the expanded measurements on well-being, which perhaps you will start to collect in your next research paper.
Yeah, it's about ethics regarding that as well. So when I was doing my master's, I was doing a lot of stuff onto like pro-social skills and how you develop those sort of things within it and measure well-being. So it's ensuring that's done in a safe way as well, that enables the child to have the support that they need, because sometimes when you're asked to reflect on those questions, you don't know the state of that person's well-being at the time. So it's important to make sure that's done in a way that is safe for the child.
Okay. So you used the word safe, but I'm curious, why is safety considered an element here?
Because if you're asking a child to reflect on their own well-being, which is also a lot of the research around like mindfulness in schools and for children as well, because you don't know the state of the child or necessarily as a researcher, but the educator might. If you're collecting data on this anonymously in the way that we did for this survey, there isn't a safeguarding aspect put in place, because if that child is reflecting on whether they're happy, how they feel about their education, in a way that's related to their own personal mental or physical well-being, that could trigger negative feelings. And so there has been a lot of research around the ethics of that, because I think it can result in somebody feeling worse about themselves, which could result in something that you wouldn't want the research to necessarily trigger.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Do Alejandro or Elizabeth have any questions? I know you guys are on the call. So we've got
actually,
yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Federica. I guess like one of the things that we want to do is like, given the activities that we're doing at schools and the fact that we're collecting, we also ask questions to every participant that go through our programs.
Mm-hmm.
We're wondering, like, if what type of questions should we ask so that we can also provide that information to this type of study,
Mm.
So I don't know if you can kind of like elaborate on that. And it's like, maybe what are like the key questions, let's say?
What sort of information would you like to collect, Alejandro? Sorry, just so I can be clear.
No, we already collect information, so like we already collect information regarding like the students' view regarding like how useful the education is.
Mm-hmm.
We also collect information regarding like what are like their habits in terms of media use.
Mm-hmm.
And we also collect information in terms of what like their interest and motivation.
Mm-hmm.
But we're wondering is more like based on this study, out of like all the things that you were measuring, what would you consider like the most critical points? Because like this, I guess like we can include it in the questionnaire that we have. Uh, but usually like our questionnaires, like, we don't have, we cannot ask as many questions because like is done like more on a massive scale, but like we may want to include like like some of the critical questions that you covered in this research and see what would those be.
I think we haven't reflected yet on the future questions that we would ask. So I think it's difficult at this point to kind of come up with any definitives. But maybe it would be around the broader question of what they would like to see improved in their education on a wider scale, because like I know that with Tricks and Tracks you're focusing on, like you said, particularly well-being and their habits and how going through the program enables them to improve and benefit. So in relation to what young people need more broadly in education, maybe we would explore questions around that. What do you think, Freddie?
Yeah, I think also having questions with that are open but maybe have prompts, because I know from working with students and feedback, sometimes they just get so overwhelmed by the question that they don't know where to start. So exactly. For example, we put the map as a prompt for topics that they could discuss, and maybe that's what they're interested in, but also the opportunity to elaborate on that. And I think that's a great way to kind of structure feedback following the topic that you want to discuss with them.
Yeah, and you can use hierarchy systems as well. So providing them with short prompts, dependent upon the age of the child doing the research, to put them into pyramid hierarchies. So there's different ways of exploring it. Depends what kind of platform you're using.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, cool.
So Jessica and Frederica, if I continue to have questions after our call today, can I still send them to you by email or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we can always set up another chat and answer any of the questions that you had if you'd like to do it in a more cool manner.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, there's so much information in this, and I'm still actually reading parts of it, and I think I will have probably comments or questions I would love to share with you. So
fantastic.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, actually.
So any final questions before we wrap up? Otherwise, we've been really, really enjoyed this discussion. It's been really great to hear from you and to talk more about the report again. It's been a little while since we focused on it.
No, I think you girls are awesome. So.
Thank you.
Agreed. You have me in that bucket.
I agree.
Okay, well, thank you so much, guys. Like we said, if you have any more questions, feel free to email me and Freddie. We can provide our emails. Yeah, sorry, there's a delivery at my door. Just 1 second. Yeah, thank you. Interesting. He's just put it through my window. Yeah, it was really great to talk about this, and we look forward to doing more research in the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys.
All right. Have a great day.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.